Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Anderson, the Chief Growth Officer at the Space Force Association, and today we continue our space warfighting talks with the Senior Enlisted Leader from the Intelligence Directorate at Space Systems Command at LA Air Force Base in Los Angeles, California, Chief Ron Lerch. Chief, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Well, we all know within the Department of the Air Force, less than 1% of all enlistees ever rise to the rank of Chief Master Sergeant. And just want to congratulate you. I know it's been a little while already, but congratulate you on that. But also, we want to tell the story to maybe some young guardians out there or even kids in high school that want to be you one day. And a lot of the folks that we've interviewed with SFA have taken some non-standard paths to get to where they're at today. And I think yours is a fantastic story. If you're willing to share it, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, definitely appreciate the opportunity again for having this conversation. When it comes to sort of my story, what I'll tell you is that you would think that I came from just a career of space, a plethora of space assignments, a lot of space experience, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I actually had no prior space assignments when I actually joined over to the Space Force. So I'm a career intel analyst, spent years serving in the Air Force, and had predominantly a low observable background career, working at the Pentagon, working at the National Military Command Center, but really never touched space per se. What drove me to go to the Space Force was as I was working at the Pentagon, working in the front office for the Secretary of the Air Force, then Secretary Barrett. At that time, Space Force was standing up, and obviously the first two Guardians started working at the building, which was General Raymond and Chief Toberman. And what was fascinating to me is every time that they came into the Secretary's office to talk about everything developing with the Space Force and sort of the road ahead, it was just fascinating to me how anytime I talked with either of them, but especially Chief Toberman at the time, he would always talk about the value of human capital and about the people. And so there was definitely no trifold that they handed any of the Master Sergeants, Senior Master Sergeants, Chiefs that they wanted to potentially come over to the Space Force. And so it was just intriguing to me that his sales pitch or the elevator pitch that he would have about why the Space Force and what they were doing, it was never about the technology, it was never about the new domain, it was never about sort of the exploration that's going to come from this, in years from now. It was about the people and taking care of them and how they were going to do things with talent management that had never been done before. And so that's what essentially got me to consider and apply for the Space Force, and I was fortunate enough to get picked up for it.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the size of the Space Force as well. When you talk about only about 9,500 Guardians in the Space Force right now, and the only military service last year to meet its recruiting goals, there's a lot of demand and interest in the Space Force. And as we continue at SFA to talk about why that's important and why the threat is out there, I think it's important to for people to look at successful chiefs like yourself and what you're into. But I wonder if you can just pull that thread a little bit on what you got to work on in the Air Force, that even you and I sitting here having this discussion today, the Senior Enlisted Leader from the Intelligence Directorate having a conversation about the threats. But what you also got to work on previously wasn't able to be talked about before, but now it is as well. Can you share a little bit of that?
Sure. There was a time where when I worked on the Nevada Test and Training Range, we were there doing some development for a new asset at the time. It couldn't be disclosed. Inevitably, it became released and is publicly known as the RQ-170. It's a stealth UAV essentially. But a lot of working in the dark, it's very complicated in terms of having to reach out and sort of coordinate with the larger intelligence community and doing some of the work for operations when not everyone even knew what the capability was or that the fact that it even existed. And so eventually there were some media releases about what was known as the Beast of Kandahar was making its sort of, getting some publicity. And that sort of led to then the official disclosure that this was a capability that the United States Force had in its possession. And obviously that was a fantastic assignment, very different in terms of sort of the location and just some of the requirements that come with it. But it truly was a part of my career where I was able to get very close to operations and have what I felt was like a significant impact in terms of furthering national security, and then also just being very, very intimately familiar with sort of special operations and the unique capabilities that they have.
Yeah, no doubt that warrior ethos that you learned with that mission and working with our joint partners, bringing that to Space Systems Command and to the Space Force in general, I think is huge. And I think it's also a testament to you personally why the senior leaders of the Space Force have asked you, a Chief Master Sergeant, to go out and talk to industry, talk to the public about the threat that our nation faces right now in that space domain. And that's one of the main reasons we're here today. It's no secret that China is our pacing threat, a pacing challenge, a near-peer competitor. There's a lot of buzzwords that have been thrown out there. And I know you've been talking to a lot of groups, both in the unclass and the classified settings. So I wanted to start with China today. our pacing threat as a nation, not just in the space domain, but there's a lot of things, economics, the military side of things, politically, diplomatically. Can you give us your initial thoughts on China and where we stand today as we look at them as a threat?
Sure. So they are obviously the lead competitor when we talk about the competition that we face today and sort of the challenges down the road. China, there's a reason that we talk about them first and foremost. With them in particular, one of the things that they've sort of mastered, which is a concern to us, is that they're really employing this whole of society approach when it comes to advancing space and talking about the significance of it. And what I mean by whole society is it's not just a government endeavor for them. They're roping in academia, industry as well, obviously, but also they're targeting their youth in terms of sort of explaining why space matters and the benefits of it. They're doing very unique things like talking about increasing STEM programs. They're even having their taikonauts teach from their new space station to children, so they're sort of creating this aura about what it takes to be and sort of the benefits of being an astronaut. And so they're doing a fabulous job in terms of organizing this whole society approach. Their media also, because as you talked about economically, they've talked extensively about the fact that the space economy is just only going to continue to get more significant. They've estimated by the 2040s and 50s that it's going to be a trillions of dollars a year industry, especially as they look at just beyond Earth and looking at cislunar space, and then even mining and milling asteroids, the moon, and some of the resources that simply just aren't available here at Earth. So when we talk about China, it's not just the capability that they're getting out at breakneck speed, not just from a counter space capability, but from also just intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The issue with them as well is that we have history to show that when there's a territory that exists that they want, they're willing to go to extreme lengths to be able to essentially get that territory. Obviously, I'm talking about the South China Seas. And so when we talk about cislunar space, when we talk about the moon, you're really talking about the potential for the celestial equivalent of a South China Sea scenario, where if they get there first, they set up the infrastructure, they have the satellites to support sort of anything in terms of navigating the moon, or at least the satellites that are supporting missions there, that becomes a concern, is that they're sort of at the head of the table and driving those conversations. And as we've seen from the past, that could be considerably dangerous.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what, if Secretary Kendall were here right now, he'd say, this is what I mean by great power competition. This is what great powers do. Military professionals have been taught the DIME acronym for a long time, where we talk about the diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And we are competing with them in all four of those categories. And I've heard from other recent interviews, and they've said, hey, I want to know when the price of grain goes up in China. I want to know, if you want to think about, we often talk about Russian oligarchs, but the Chinese have their own version of wealthy families that have been in power for decades and may or may not have their money and their resources dispersed all over the globe. When that money starts moving, our intelligence professionals want to know. These could be non-standard indications and warnings that our country needs to think about. Let's shift gears a little bit to Russia. A few years have passed now since Russia invaded Ukraine. And we are learning a lot of lessons. The world is learning a lot of lessons. But very recently, General Whiting, the commander of U.S. Space Command, told the Senate Armed Services Committee, let's not take our eye off of Russia when we talk about the space domain. Get your thoughts on Russia as how, maybe compare and contrast where they are at with China in the space domain.
Sure, yeah, they've got their hands tied, obviously, with the conflict in Ukraine, and that's taken a considerable toll in terms of their spending and from the defense side of things, where their programs that they originally had forecasted and where they were going to be simply aren't where they're at now. And that's sort of the cause of obviously everything that's happened with having to now resupply things that they probably weren't counting on having to resupply. So everything from troops to tanks, armor, you name it. These are the things that their defense sector is essentially focused on right now. When we talk about how we can't take our eye off of Russia, a prime example of this is the recent intelligence that has been confirmed by the administration and talked about extensively in the media, which is the counter-satellite or anti-satellite capability that we have intelligence to suggest that the Russians are investing in and looking at putting into orbit in the very near future. And this is a capability where, simply put, if you're talking about detonating a nuclear weapon in space, there's going to be effects for that kind of a capability that aren't surgical per se. It's going to be something that impacts significant portions of space, makes significant portions of it unusable. And to be fair, you've had efforts in the past like Starfish Prime where we've tested high altitude nuclear detonations, but with these kind of capabilities and with the Russians sort of behind it, The ultimate concern is what will it take, or what sort of red line needs to be crossed for them to feel like this is a capability that they now need to execute in space. And that's the point of concern there. But ultimately, we should not take our eye off the fact that the Russians are still innovating, they're still putting up capability in space, and while they may not have the same number of satellites, they may not have the same intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance sort of apparatus supporting that, we still have to honor the fact that the Russians are investing in these novel technologies that are designed to still keep NATO at bay and still pose a threat to the West. And it's not just in space. One of the other systems that's been talked about recently is the Skyfall. You know, you're talking about a nuclear-powered cruise missile. So not just nuclear-armed, but nuclear-powered cruise missile. So there certainly has been precedence, and there certainly are examples just in recent history where this is clearly something that the Russians still value, and we can't take our eye off the fact that they still pose a threat.
Yeah, I think just a few months ago, the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, released a white paper that talked about competitive endurance. And he's asking the Space Force to think about competitive endurance in a few different facets, but one of them is avoiding operational surprise.
Sure.
And I think I want to go back to China a little bit. One way to avoid operational surprise is to have really good space domain awareness. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, when people think about space situational awareness and they compare it to space domain awareness, I've heard the comparison of the attacks on 9/11. On that day, the FAA had space situational awareness. They knew that there were planes up in the air, and when they grounded them, they were all on the ground. But only NORAD was attempting to get actual domain awareness. What is the intent of these hijackers? What is the intent? So if you can get a fighter aircraft up next to a hijacked aircraft, there are certain things you can see in the cockpit, whether the shades are down or who's actually in control of the aircraft. You can start to judge intent. China has shown that they have unbelievable space domain awareness with some of their recent actions. Can we dive into a little bit more of the details from an unclassified threat perspective on China, and give us a peek under the tent from your perspective?
Sure. So when we talk about China, I think it's important to remember that any potential conflict that happens by 2027 or after, because I think that's important to also foot stomp, is we get so wrapped around the X sometimes of thinking that there's this potential conflict that could occur by 2027, and that when 2027 hits, New Year's Eve for 2028, that we're all of a sudden going to be able to just take a nice, deep breath and say, all right, it's over, we're past it. And that's not the case. 2027 could easily become 2030 and so on. But when we talk about 2027 and sort of why that matters, one of the big things, and as you said, sort of what's under the tent, is we have to remember that this, for China and a Taiwan conflict, it's a home game, right? And so in terms of what capabilities do they have on mainland, what assets do they have that are parked all the way out in geo that are essentially providing that neighborhood cop function and doing space domain awareness, for them, they have the benefit of this is their physical territory. And so the assets that they have on the mainland that are able to see the space, the radars that they have, the telescopes that they've got, the surface vessels that are essentially ships with exquisite equipment that are out at sea. These are all things that they are essentially using to help feed what they have as space domain awareness. And we've seen evidence of how good that space domain awareness is. There's a very well documented history, completely unclassified and available via publicly available information, that documents sort of this cat and mouse game that's happened in space out at GEO, where you essentially have Chinese and US satellites following each other, and which is why they call it a cat and mouse game. To be able to do that and to be able to have the fidelity of information to make those decisions and to have that capability, that inherently requires exquisite space domain awareness. So it's something that we should certainly not take away from the Chinese or think that we potentially have better awareness than them, at least right now, especially since, like I said earlier, this is a home game for them and potentially an away game for us.
Yeah, it's every commander of Space Command, Space Operations Command continues to talk about, I need to understand the domain more. And if we want to start thinking about the United States dynamic space operations and how we compare to China and Russia, we clearly have got to continue to up our game in the SDA realm. I wanted to bring it back to you personally a little bit more.
Sure.
As you look at how unique this is, that as a Chief Master Sergeant in the Space Force, you're out talking to public venues about the threat. Compare and contrast that with our Chinese counterparts.
Sure. So simply put, that wouldn't be happening in China. There's so much, mission command, just the idea of mission command and how you would delegate authority and how you would trust organizations and your subordinates to be able to get after your guidance and intent that you outline. That's something that we know the PRC is not good at. We know that they're struggling with that. And it really goes against sort of what the CCP and sort of the philosophy that exists within the country in terms of where decisions are made and what echelons those decisions are made. And so trust is a very important word when we talk about sort of what separates us from our Chinese counterparts. Here in the US, enlisted troops, especially in the Space Force, we don't have a ceiling per se in terms of what are we capable of doing and what opportunities can we be provided. I mean, we have people, some of the most notable generals that are out there were prior enlisted. And so when I say there's no ceiling for them, there really isn't. And sort of the opportunities that are out there, the unique assignments that are out there, they're sort of there for the taking. And you just have to have the initiative to be able to go and pursue those kind of opportunities. In the PLA side, it's just simply not the same. When you look at us, we have a senior enlisted leader that goes all the way up to the chairman.
Yeah.
In the PLA, they are senior enlisted leaders that they have. They're not really singular individuals, it's more of a group, so you have onset of groupthink and things like that obviously plague those type of organizations, and they stop at the brigade level. And so in terms of where they value sort of their senior enlisted input and just their enlisted trust that they have, it's clear just from an organizational design that it's nowhere near in terms of what we have here in the US. And it, simply put, is our advantage. In terms of competitive advantages that we have, our enlisted corps is absolutely that. You can talk to the Ukrainians about sort of what the NCOs have done for them on the battle lines in a real world conflict environment, and I can almost assure that when you look at the PLA and sort of the tail of the tape, when the time comes, if it comes, where there is conflict, one of our competitive advantages is going to be the enlisted corps that we have and how much trust we put in them to be able to get after mission, make decisions, and be essentially act in a capacity similar to our officer counterparts when needed.
Without a doubt, that's a competitive advantage for us, and I think, having decades of an all-volunteer force that we can lean back on, and people like yourself and our parents that may or may not have served and just pass those lessons down to us that, hey, serving in the military, this is a good way of life. I look at your specific background. You mentioned you worked in the National Military Command Center, the NMCC. You worked for the Secretary of the Air Force. Now you work here in Space Systems Command, the acquisition arm or the field command of the Space Force, in the S2, so the Intelligence Directorate. I don't think that's inherently obvious to the casual observer why an acquisition command would need an Intelligence Directorate. Can you give us a little bit of perspective on why that's important and the role that your team plays?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a time in history where it was okay for 10 years to get a program into space from, in terms of conceptualization, the conceptual part of it to actually putting it in orbit. That was totally fine. Space was relatively a benign environment. It's simply not the case today. The pace of what, in particular, the Chinese are putting into space is significantly more than what we've seen in years past. To be able to keep up with that pace, you have to adjust in terms of how you actually do design, how you do this conceptualization, how you create this capability and get it into something that's actually out there and available for the forces to use. To be able to match that pace, you have to have Intel involved. And so as much as I'd love to be able to say that when you look at sort of the acquisition life cycle chart, how there's these milestones that are throughout, that there's only certain parts that you just need Intel, the reality is we're in a point right now where that's just not the case. And if you do that, what you're running the risk of is having outdated information. You're going to inform the program offices of a capability that's outdated, and it's already been surpassed in terms of what the adversary has capable or has already actually employed. And so it's absolutely vital in terms of how intelligence supports the acquisition arm here. And when we started this organization, and we were at the time working for Lieutenant General Gutwein, who had tasked the S2 with ensuring that not just his workforce was threat informed, but that industry was informed. He basically took the leash off of us to be able to go off and make sure that we were doing everything in our power, from not just stovepiping data and saying, well, hey, here's a conference, and if you have the right clearances, great, you're going to be able to come to the Intel briefing. Now we're doing this in unclassified settings. We're going to industry. They're coming to us if able. If we're ever out visiting some of our geographically separated units, we're making sure that we pay our industry partners a visit when we're out there, just to be able to at least give them something in terms of what the current threat is or what changes have happened in the space domain. And even if it's in an unclassified level, it's still important to communicate those changes.
Yeah, I think that's huge. As industry, especially publicly traded companies in the United States, when we think about the difference between us and China, industry is also a competitive advantage if we take advantage of it in the right way.
Sure.
And if we're, General Saltzman, Secretary Kendall, and the Honorable Cal Valley have all talked about extreme teaming, teaming with industry. When we really and truly team with industry, it's hard to beat the United States of America. But part of that is sharing the intelligence, sharing what the government knows, so that industry can spend their own pennies, those dollars that shareholders track, just like taxpayers track government dollars, shareholders are tracking those so that industry can invest in the same things. So we've talked a little bit about what our adversaries are developing, but I want the American people to be assured for what we're doing as well. Can you talk about what the United States is good at and what perhaps our adversaries, if from their perspective, they should be worried about us?
Sure, yeah, the adversary should absolutely be worried. When you look at, we'll say Russia as an example for this, it's no secret that something that they have been itching to be able to get after in terms of something that's just been a pain in their, thorn in their side since the invasion of Ukraine has been commercial resources that have allowed the Ukrainians to do command and control and communication. And that's something that the Russians were not counting on to be available for the Ukrainian military to be able to use. And so the innovation that comes with being able to provide those capabilities to a military so that they can do that critical function of C3 and being able to not operate in an environment where they're blind or deaf, it's hugely vital. And I think we've all seen how it's paid off for the Ukrainians because what should have been on paper, a conflict that ended relatively early, is still ongoing, and it's evident and clear that the Ukrainians are putting up a fight. When you look at the Chinese and in terms of, what do they have to be worried about? We know that they're worried because when it comes to intellectual theft, they come to the U.S. in terms of how they can just sort of leapfrog all the R&D that we do and the innovation that we are after to be able to just come up with a viable solution that they can just sort of, like I said, not worry about spending the dollars to be able to do that, and they just sort of leapfrog to a solution. They're getting to that point, and they're doing that because they know what the U.S. is doing in terms of what we are resourcing. They know what industry is creating. They know it's exquisite. They know it's capable. And so it's obvious in terms of just the intellectual theft and the sort of proprietary data that gets stolen from not just the clear defense contractors, but just our networks in general and cybersecurity. It's clear that they're concerned about it. What we have as another issue for the PRC is that their industrial base does not have a fantastic reputation. There was a point in history where if you look at just a separate domain on the air side, you had turbofan engines that were cracking, right? The engine blades are cracking on these fighters that they're trying to develop to other countries. That's not a good problem that you want to have if you're trying to export a certain fighter aircraft. Their J-20, which is supposed to be their 5th gen fighter, you essentially have a Lamborghini that's powered by a Honda engine because the engine and how they were able to design it was nowhere near sort of what we're able to design in terms of capable aircraft engines. And so there's a history of their industrial base not being at the same standard, and I just don't think we've had the opportunity and the time to be able to see how that's played out in space. When we look at the U.S., we have systems on orbit that really have no business still being on orbit and fully functioning when you look at the original design life and how long its expectancy was, and it's still up there and it's still doing mission. We have yet to see what that looks like through the PRC lens in terms of them putting a capability up that meets design life or even exceeds it. And so time will tell whether or not their industrial base is sort of playing in the same league as our industrial base. But as of right now, I think it's safe to say that we're just operating at a different level. And one thing that I will add on to that, just from the time that I've been able to get out and about and speak directly with industry, and it's a point that you were making right before you asked the question, is that it's very important for people to understand that our brothers and sisters in industry, they're just patriots wearing different uniforms, right? What they're after and sort of how focused they are on 2027 and sort of ensuring that national security is sort of always at the, is always a conversation driver in their different organizations. That's been clear and obvious to us as we've gone out and gone to different conference rooms and been to different tours and have seen industry at play. It's been evident, it's been just very evident to us that these are patriots. They're just wearing a different type of uniform and that they're here for, it's one team, one fight.
No, that's awesome to hear. It reminds me of, when General Saltzman released his white paper talking about competitive endurance, the second thing he talked about is denying first mover advantage. Yeah. How do we deny first mover advantage in the space domain? And, when I think about that, I immediately go back to the former STRATCOM commander and General Hyten, who's just a legend in the space community, and he just continued to talk about, we got to stop getting rid of these big, juicy targets. And when you're talking about ones out in GEO, $1 billion satellites in GEO, and and what the Space Development Agency has been able to do the past couple of years under the leadership of Derek Tournier to get a proliferated LEO, to really make that first mover advantage not an advantage at all. From your perspective, do you see the Chinese or the Russians trying to copy what we've been doing there and proliferating LEO on their own as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that there's a PRC project, completely unclassified, known as the Guang, which aims to be a 13,000 satellite constellation that they have in LEO, so proliferated LEO. One of the things for anyone who's ever seen sort of our unclassified briefs, one of the things that we like to do is this sort of tail of the tape of the numbers comparison of what the Russians had, what the Chinese had, and really we're probably 2-3 years away for where the numbers aren't going to matter anymore. It's not going to even be relevant in terms of the conversation, especially when you're talking about 13,000 proliferated LEO type architecture that the PRC wants. But the function is going to be key. And to your point about first mover advantage, one of the things that we have to be mindful of is first mover advantage, this next conflict that kicks off, if there's anything that we learned from the Ukrainians and the Russians and what happened in the days leading up to no kidding Russian troops marching towards Ukraine and in their territory, it's that the next conflict is going to start not with a kinetic shot. It's going to be shooting ones and zeros. It's going to be cyber. It's going to be electronic warfare. And oddly enough, that's going to be potentially what the general public is going to see and feel, but not understand that the implications of it are related to a conflict that's hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. And what I mean by that is when you go after the cyber infrastructure, when you go after our critical infrastructure, you're essentially sowing the seeds of discord back home to just generate confusion, generate just chaos, while then you're able to sort of take advantage of that and see how the U.S. has got their hands tied with that to then basically move into and seize Taiwan in relatively short order. That is in a perfect world what a country like China would love to be able to do. But all of that starts with, like I said, a first shot being taken using ones and zeros and going after cyber, going after EW, and targeting even potentially our civilian infrastructure just for the purpose of creating enough chaos on the home turf that our hands are tied and that we aren't able to invest appropriately into defending Taiwan.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about how it affects all portions of not only the military but our government. And the third part of General Saltzman's white paper was responsible counter-space campaigning. Responsible counter-space campaigning. So in a responsible manner, if we think at other domains, if you want to achieve air superiority or maritime superiority or on the land, for example, that might involve blowing something up. In order to gain that superiority, you might have to destroy something. And that's one of the challenges in the space domain. If you're trying to remove an advantage from your adversary but maintain your own advantage of space, you cannot be irresponsible in the space domain and do an anti-satellite missile and that creates debris all over LEO, GEO, or MEO, for example. So what we've seen, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this, is just like in the other domains, an introduction of this gray zone on what China and Russia want us to think, no, this is acceptable. This is normal behavior, and as long as they do it enough and we don't respond to it, it just becomes this gray zone that if we don't act on it or get a whole of government or coalitions and partners to say, no, that's not okay in space, these normalized standards of behavior. Can you talk about the danger of that gray zone, maybe what we've seen with China and Russia, what they've done recently to kind of just push the limit there, below the threshold of armed conflict, but still a gray zone?
Yeah, absolutely. So, within the intelligence community and even parts of the DoD, we often refer to as the Ukraine and Russia conflict as the first commercial space war, just because of how pivotal commercial space has been in terms of offering capabilities. And if it's not the C3 part that I talked about earlier, it's imaging and seeing these columns and these formations of Russian troops and equipment marching into Ukraine, even though the Kremlin's saying that they're not doing that, and sort of really getting after sort of the disinformation that happens. And so when we talk about gray zone and sort of how they're exploiting that, we're absolutely seeing that in terms of what the Chinese do. They love to jam things up in court. They do lawfare, and they do it pretty well. They did it with the South China Seas and sort of the territorial claims there. We've seen evidence in the media where they talk about how 10 kilometers is what they believe the norm should be for how the distance between two spacecraft. And so then they're using that to sort of fuel a narrative that our proliferated LEO, Starlink, that essentially it poses a threat to their space station at times because Starlink satellites are not abiding by this 10-kilometer distance that they believe is what should realistically be the distance between spacecraft that promotes sort of safety in space. So that's an example of sort of how they are using that gray zone to further their agenda and talk about sort of their narrative that they're really getting after. And ultimately what they're trying to do there is really how can they jam up sort of in legal proceedings what could potentially then be a holdup for further proliferated LEO network or other capabilities that go into space, because they sort of start saying, well, hey, we didn't get the opportunity to, or the way that they were able to sort of get these orbits was illegal. And so we want to hold on this. All the while, it sort of gives them an opportunity to catch up in terms of their capability. The Russians, they've been a little bit more direct. There was a UN meeting where the topic at hand a couple of years ago was safety in space. And they sent a representative who, in his opening remarks, essentially said that if you're supporting the war, then it doesn't matter if you're commercial, you're a target. And so they made it very clear that in their eyes, and you know, at least from the Kremlin's perspective, that if you are contributing to a war zone or to a conflicted area, that they will consider you a viable and legal target. And so we are definitely in a point right now where in terms of what's right or what's wrong in space and who gets to sort of carve what norms are, I think you're going to see over the next decade that that's really going to take central in terms of the discussion about the space domain and could potentially be a rallying point for some of the key parties to get involved and talk about what is right, what's not wrong. Otherwise, you're going to have these potential situations like with this anti-satellite nuclear capability that the Russians potentially will have in orbit. And instead of being able to discuss these kind of issues and talk about the negative aspect of it and why they shouldn't do it, the Russians could potentially put it in orbit, and now you're going to have arguably the most polarizing event in terms of the history of the space domain and what comes from it. You know, there's a lot of different ways it could go, and one of obviously the more fearful ways is that it really begins the true weaponization of space.
I'm glad you brought up the commercial with the Russian-Ukraine conflict and specifically with space. When we think of space in our country, we think civil, commercial, and national security space, kind of a triad, if you will. Does that exist in China, or is it all basically the same thing?
Yeah, for them, they absolutely have made strides in terms of what it means for them to have an industrial base and a commercial entity. But make no mistake about it, the commercial entities there are sort of designed to be able to attract and get into markets that historically have probably wanted to stay away from doing business with China. You know, using Long March rockets, which are affiliated with the PLA, to be able to put your commercial payload into orbit. Folks have sort of steered clear of that. But as China has really tapped into creating its own true commercial market, it becomes a little bit more stomachable for folks to do business with the Chinese because it's their commercial side of it. They've even, most recently here, just earlier this year, they've actually created their first spaceport for commercial use. One of the launch pads is already available, and then there's a second, more universal launch pad that's going to open up, I believe, sometime this spring. And so they're definitely making the strides in terms of not just the launch systems, but even the infrastructure to really get after how they can sort of promote themselves as not just being the military side of space, but also being the civil side as well. And then obviously, like we've talked about already, they have their own space station, they're doing their own exploration. They have absolutely some ambitious plans in terms of further exploration of not just the moon, but even going out to Mars. So for them, as I alluded to earlier when I talk about whole society, they're certainly not just trying to make it sound like, hey, our interest in space is not one of just we want to have military advantage. They are communicating and messaging to the people there that this is almost like part of their destiny, that they're destined to be exploring space in places that the U.S. has not gotten to, that they're going to get there first before we do, that they have the Artemis program that we have to sort of get to the moon by 2030. They have a direct competitor to that in the form of their International Lunar Research Station, which they were very, very tight with the Russians at first. And as over time they started to see that maybe the Russians aren't going to be able to contribute as much as they'd like, they've really started to open the apparatus for that to attract other partners. And so they're doing everything from making it more civil, making a commercial strides. They're attracting international cooperation. These cooperation efforts are then leading to other avenues for them in terms of how they are able to potentially exploit these new countries as client states and really expand how much influence the country has in these regions as well.
Chief, we're slowly running out of time, but I just wanted to, if I had a crystal ball and as we approach a presidential election in our own country and China and Russia have their own political challenges, I can't help but think I'm going to hear these talking points that you've brought up today and you've been sharing with industry and guardians around the world actually later throughout this year. And I really hope our elected officials bring these topics up and we have adult conversations in public and talk about where our nation as a whole of government really needs to go. But any parting thoughts for our viewers before we go?
Yeah, I think the key thing to understand really, why a Space Force? That's a really popular question, especially here in LA. You can't go to a grocery store or stop and get gas without folks being interested because there's just not that much military in the area. And a very common question is about, hey, why do we need a Space Force, or why the Space Force? What do you guys actually do? And I think the sooner that people understand that their everyday lives can be impacted by hostile acts in space, I think then it'll be much easier to have these conversations, and people will be much more willing to entertain the investment that's required for space and to understand the benefit of exploration of space. We are living in a world right now where if GPS went away, it is not that you just won't be able to Uber to your favorite restaurant or get to the airport on time. Reality is, as I said with the word time there, the airport's not even going to be working because financial institutions, modes of transportation, all across the planet, they are relying on the fact that they are essentially referencing the same time, just in different time zones. And if you don't have GPS, if you don't have precision navigation timing, all of that goes away. And so when we talk about the need for the Space Force, when we talk about it being a warfighting domain, the benefit of it is, for as long as GPS has existed, people understand and appreciate the technology without ever knowing what it was beforehand. And I can't even tell you the last time I saw someone take out a map and actually reference how to get from point A to point B. And so I think it's important to just really understand, and if there's anything I can impart on anyone who sees this, for them to really appreciate that this is a warfighting domain, there's a threat, and that the protection of it is going to be key, not just for the U.S., but for the whole world. And everything that we're seeing happening here near Earth is just going to really expand out into greater distances. Cislunar is going to be probably by the 2030s and 40s and beyond. It's really going to be important and imperative for people to understand what you actually truly get from space.
Yeah, and no different than the heroes, the Americans that work in the nuclear triad from the various services, how those weapons, that capability is actually being employed every day from a deterrent standpoint. Everything that's going on in the space domain, and make no mistake, the United States does not want a war in space. We will deter to the best of our ability, but if called upon, the Space Force is ready. So Chief, thanks for your words today on behalf of the entire Space Force Association. Look forward to future communications.
I appreciate it. Thanks again.